Welcome everyone to, can you hear me? Welcome to the Resolves. We'll be doing some magic tricks and card tricks and things. That's what you came for, right? Okay. Okay, we will get started. This is the 250th anniversary of the Pembroke Resolves from December 28, 1772, which was signed here in the church 250 years ago, plus a week, because December 28th is not such a good time with the holidays and things to have a major event. So you all have your packets? Does everyone have a packet? So it's front and back, so make sure you don't miss a page. And we'll refer to the pages for you so you don't get lost, but we'll probably get lost, so you'll get lost too. So so this is the I have the agenda on the back. So we have nine things we're going to be doing today, and the first is the establishment of the Resolves, and that the Resolves Day, our local rep here, Josh Cutler for Duxbury, Pembroke, and Hanson, he started that with Reverend Bert Hanson, if you can see in Bert White. I'm sorry, Bert White. You'll see a picture of that was actually our first Resolves Day was 2018, and a lot of the people came there on a rainy day. We had it at the town office, and it was raining and miserable day, and we took a picture of Bert. I think Kyle took a picture of Bert, and so we have that here. And he got us all started. There was some story about he was in a town meeting, and they were talking about some obscure topic, and he ended up saying, "Hey, this is Pembroke Resolves month." And Josh, you want to say how that all formed?
Sure.
You want to come up?
Yeah, sure.
All right. I don't know all the story.
Okay. Hey, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Just very briefly, this past week I had the pleasure of being sworn in again to serve Town of Pembroke and my other communities in the legislature up on Beacon Hill, and we had some ceremony with the peaceful transition to a new administration from Governor Baker to Governor Healy, and it really I was thinking about this event as that was going on, thinking about this transition, the tradition that we have here in Massachusetts, where we led the nation in so many ways. As I got home later that evening, was watching the transition happening in Washington D.C. It was a little bit more chaotic, but here in Massachusetts, we've always led the way, and that's if you look at more recent history with just on various policy items, Massachusetts has led the way. But even going back to our earliest days as a nation, the U.S. Constitution was formed based off our Massachusetts Constitution. And I think about those things here when we're on Beacon Hill, and I emphasize the word beacon because I think Massachusetts has always been a beacon for the rest of the nation. And in that same sense, Pembroke has been a beacon for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Thinking about back 250 years ago, the residents sitting here and the role that they played in leading our nation forward and making these historic resolves. So it's pretty cool, and the credit goes to Bert White, who was so persistent and insistent upon us recognizing this properly. And he really, I think he cornered me at a town meeting one year and started talking to me about this. And I have to admit, I didn't really fully know about the Pembroke Resolves at that time, but I made sure I did after that, because Bert was very persistent. And so really credit goes to him and Miles. And I'm really grateful to the Pembroke Historical Society. You guys do such great work here to make sure we respect and realize and keep our great Pembroke history that we have. So I wanted to just thank Bert and acknowledge that. I know he couldn't be here with us, but he's done a lot to make sure that this day was here and that we were able to formally celebrate it back in 2018, which seems so long ago pre-COVID, with Governor Baker signing the day, officially designating Pembroke Resolves Day. And I'm glad to be here joining you again, and hope to be back up soon to participate in my little piece of the resolve. So thank you.
So in your handouts, you'll see a Pembroke Resolves Day plaque. Does everyone see that? That's actually over there on the right. It's on that easel board. So that's the official documentation. And also in the in the slides, you'll see a photograph of the Pembroke Resolves, the actual, in the town hall. There's a copy of it, so the actual original is in the town hall, and Steve Herman here found that 5 years ago, made copies of it, and then later on, Beth Dwyer, the former president of the Pembroke Historical Society, myself, and Leona Roach had transcribed the resolves, and so we have plaques over here that have the Pembroke Resolves as it stood from us, and then the Boston paper that published it 2 weeks later, and then our common day interpretation of it, because the language, we had to get a decoder ring to figure out the writing and everything. It was very difficult. So, and then important to the church is there's a slide that shows this here, this board here is related to this first church. So at one point in time, that was probably posted on the outside of the building, and it talks about how this meeting house was built in 1708. Actually, the first church was actually down on Mountain Ave originally, and then they moved, the congregation was moved here, and then they did some military training on the outside. It talks about the Pembroke Resolve 1772, but they have the date December 23rd, so we just think they didn't circle their threes. So, but that's kept in the that's in the museum, where everyone's invited afterwards to see these see some of the items that we'll be talking about here. So I think now Steve's our historian, and he's going to tell about what the meaning of the resolves was, why we're all here today. I figure we're going to be talking about the real patriots that had muskets and medical bags and quill and pen and paper, and we're not talking about the ones that are wearing helmets and helmets and shoulder gear. So
Thanks, Miles.
why don't you come up?
Wow. So my name's Steve Herman. I'm a former history teacher, and I've been researching some of the history of Pembroke, specifically to the people that served in the French and Indian War. And so I would like to try to put the Pembroke Resolves in a historical context, because sometimes people just hear about the Resolves, they don't know where it fits into the pantheon of events, as Josh said, that led to the Civil War. Pembroke really was a community that led in a number of ways to the Revolution. So bear with me. There's a lot of papers here, and I'm going to just try to go through them briefly, but I thought you might look at this later and try to fit these events with what happened in the lead up to the Revolution. So as this might sound like one of your high school history classes way back, but bear with me. So I'm on page 1, Events in Colonial History that led to the Pembroke Resolves. So there's a lot of theories about what led up to the Revolution. Why did Americans who would toast every meal to the King of England and thought of themselves as part of this huge British Empire, how they would in a few years from fighting in the French Indian War, 20 years later they're fighting against the British. How did that happen? It was a mindset thing, as well as obviously the no taxation without representation that everybody knows about. So anyway, in researching the people that fought in the French Indian War, we found that there were a lot of these people that fought in the French Indian War that also were the movers and shakers in the Pembroke Resolves. So I thought I'd just kind of go through this quickly. So I'm looking at Intercontinental Wars timeline. There's a box on page 1, and the French Indian War is the event that started the whole movement shifting in people's minds towards revolution. There were 4 French and Indian Wars, and there were Pembrokians that fought in all of them. The King George's War, 1744 to 48, had a huge number of Pembrokians that fought in that war, but the real swing is the 54 to 63 French and Indian War. And so flip the page, feel free to look at this later, but the French and Indian War was the first global war. it was a huge competition between empires. The French Empire, the first was the Spanish and the Portuguese, and as that faded, the French and the English began to compete for colonies in North America. I'm sure this is familiar to everybody. The British colonies had a huge numerical population in comparison to the French. I have here 2 million versus 60,000 in New France. So the contest, the Americans here, the British colonists in the 13 colonies were, their main boogeyman was the French and the Roman Catholic Church. And you read in the writings of soldiers and politicians and clergy of the time, that was the big enemy. Everybody was afraid of France. And so to look at how that played out in everyday events in people's lives, I'm on page 3 now. Each colony, I want to talk quickly about the militia system. Every able-bodied man in Pembroke and all the colonies had to show up for militia training once a month or so. They were required by law between teenage years and 60. Everybody had to carry a weapon, had to keep it clean, had to bring it to musters. And there were fines, fairly hefty fines. In Pembroke, it was a 5-pound fine, which is a huge amount of money. It would be like $500 if you didn't show up for militia training. And the militia training took place right here. Are you people familiar with Azadad Farms? Right up the street here. That was the militia training and where the recruiting took place for the French-Indian War. I actually have a document here that shows how those people were ordered to show up for recruitment. And so the idea that I wanted to present quickly is that the militiamen that fought in the French-Indian War were treated differently than their British counterparts. As you may not know, the militiamen that served in the French-Indian War from Massachusetts were part of a provisional army. They weren't part of the British Army. They were subordinate to the British Army in every way. And so basically my argument for how the mindset changed was that provisional troops that showed up mostly in Crown Point, which is at the base of Lake Champlain, most of the fighting of Pembrokians took place at what's called Fort McHenry or Crown Point. These provisional soldiers were called up to fight, and they were not very well treated by the British. They were treated differently than the British. Their pay was different, their service was different. They basically were given subordinate, they were given menial tasks like building roads, bridges, latrines, boats, that kind of thing, whereas British soldiers did most of the fighting. When Massachusetts militia were introduced into the fighting in the French and Indian War, they were often not properly trained, not properly armed, not properly provisioned, and I think they carried this evidence of bigotry against colonists into their later lives. And one thing that was particularly important in the letter of provisional soldiers was their contracts to serve, which everybody served as part of a contract. They were signed up in March usually of every year, and then they served till December. And one thing that's very evident from the record of letters and so forth from Pembrokians in particular was that they were required to serve months and months longer than their contract stated they had to. And a lot of people bore tremendous grudges towards the British about that. So I could go into more detail, but I have a feeling that it's probably not worth doing. So we'll get to the Stamp Act. All right, so if you ask any historian what the big turning point in legislation is, in 1765, the British passed the Stamp Act. And the reason for that was that the French-Indian War, which the British won and basically ousted the French from North America, doubled the size of the debt in Britain. So there's a huge debt, and most British citizens looked at it as a problem that was caused by the French-Indian War. And colonists benefited, in the British mind, colonists benefited from that, and so they initiated this huge tax. If people are, I'm sure, I see a lot of historians in the audience, so I'm sure you're all familiar with the Stamp Act, but basically the British required that everybody buy a stamp, and that stamp go, or a piece of paper with a stamp on it, and that tax was was unavoidable. Any document that you had, any legal document that was of any value in the colonists, it was thought, would have to have this stamp on it. You have to pay cash for the stamp, and there was no way to avoid that. Americans, the British colonists in America had tremendously numerous ways to avoid taxes. All kinds of smuggling, there was all kinds of ways to avoid direct taxes. And so this one here was particularly egregious. The Stamp Act caused tremendous anxiety in the colonies, and there's a number of ways this applies specifically to Pembroke history. In the 13 colonies, the first thing that you probably know is the committees of correspondence were created as a result of the stamp tax. And of course, the 5 signers of the resolves were the Pembroke committees of correspondence. That's who those people were. They weren't the selectmen. One of them was a selectman, but they were a committee of correspondence. Stamp agents all over the colonies, all 13 colonies, were threatened. They were hanged in effigy. The British the Stamp Act collector for Massachusetts, a man named Andrew Oliver, his body was hung in effigy from the Liberty Tree in Boston Common and burned. And then the lieutenant governor at the time, Tom Hutchinson, his house was burned. A lot of his papers were thrown into the street and burned. So there was a lot of anger in Massachusetts and in all the colonies against the Stamp Act. So this plays out in a number of ways in Pembroke history. So I'm flipping to page 16 now. And one thing that's particularly important is that Andrew Oliver and Thomas Hutchinson start writing letters back to Britain. They have the ear of a number of members of Parliament, and Thomas Hutchinson is actually asking the British Parliament in secret to punish his own citizenry. He's asking the British Parliament to send troops to Boston to punish the rebels. These people burned his house down. And he asked them for a number of things, including sending troops. And so, obviously, you know that in 68, troops are sent to Boston. 1,000 troops are sent to Boston. There's I have a picture of the famous painting by Paul Revere that you've all seen over and over again of 1,000 troops landing in 68 in Boston. So just to keep going in perspective, 1770, March 5th, 1770 is the Boston Massacre. Most historians don't believe that had long-lasting effects, but it did change a number of people's minds in terms of where they were with regards to the British Empire. And then lastly, the Boston Pamphlet, 1772. So the Boston Pamphlet was the city of Boston had their own committees of correspondence, and they sat down and they wrote this 47-page tome that comes in 3 parts. It lists the rights of citizens, and if you read the rights of citizens listed in the pamphlet, it would look a lot like a lot of the other documents that you see in American history, the Declaration of Independence particularly chief among them. The second part is a list of infringements, things that the British had done wrong, and then the third part directly applies to the Pembroke Resolves. It's a letter to other towns asking for their opinion to be made public about the Boston pamphlet. And that's what the Pembroke Resolves are. So again, the committees of correspondence in Boston set out the Boston pamphlet. They ask for opinions on it, and Pembroke responds. And Pembroke is one of about 3 dozen towns that responds to the Boston pamphlet. What makes the Pembroke Resolves a little bit different is that the Pembroke Resolves are a little bit more aggressive in what they think is going to happen if the British continue their activities in Boston and in the colonies. So they basically suggest there could be independence. So this is what makes Pembroke a little bit different. So lastly, I want to, in terms of that, the lead up, I want to mention a story that some of you may have heard already, but it's fascinating to me, and that has to do with Benjamin Franklin. So some of you may have heard this, but the letters between Thomas Hutchinson and the British Parliament are intercepted by Benjamin Franklin, as Benjamin Franklin was the Postmaster General. And Benjamin Franklin at the time was looking for a better job in Britain. He wanted to be a higher ranking official than he was, and he was grubbing around in London for a way to get a better job. And he probably did the worst thing he possibly could have done. He intercepted these letters from Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts colony, and that were complaining about Boston's behavior, and he gave them back to the Massachusetts legislature. So he basically ratted out the governor of Massachusetts to the legislature of Massachusetts, which already didn't like Thomas Hutchinson. Now there's a little bit of I'm talking about the secret Hutchinson-Oliver letters. And so Hutchinson asked for, the big one was he asked the salaries paid to the governor and the judges in Massachusetts. This is the biggest impetus to the Boston pamphlet. He asked that those salaries, instead of being paid by the Massachusetts legislature, would be paid directly by the Crown. And that's important. You'll see that all over the Pembroke. It's in the Pembroke Resolves. And I don't know if I hope everybody understands the importance of that. If the Crown is paying the governor directly, then the Massachusetts citizens have virtually no control over the governor at all. They don't have the power of the purse over him. And this was what really ticked off the legislature. And so this is where the whole idea of the Boston pamphlet got started. Now, what happened was that Franklin is found out in London as the person that ratted out the governor. And that sort of doesn't really that doesn't apply directly to the Resolves except in one way. Franklin is found out and he's brought to the Solicitor General of the British government in a place called Whitehall, or near Whitehall. It's called they called it the Cockpit. It was a building that had originally been used for cockfighting. And the Solicitor General brings he brings Franklin before this committee that's looking at the removal of Thomas Hutchinson. So the Massachusetts legislature asks the governor of Massachusetts to be removed in London, and they basically are having a trial to consider the removal of the Massachusetts governor. They bring Benjamin Franklin into this meeting, and the meeting really had nothing to do with removal of the governor. The British government was not going to remove the governor. What they did was they pilloried Benjamin Franklin, and they accused him of all kinds of crimes. There's an hour of the Solicitor General, a guy named Wedderburn, where he tears Franklin apart. Franklin literally stands there and gets abused for an hour and watches his career as a future diplomat for London completely destroyed. And that event, in that sort of trial of Franklin, the Pembroke Resolves are cited as something that Benjamin Franklin essentially caused. And so that's how the Pembroke Resolves was actually read into that trial of Franklin after the resolves were signed and so forth. And that's kind of where the Pembroke Resolves becomes famous in Britain. All right, anyone that wants to read the specifics of that trial and so forth is right there at the bottom. So lastly, I'm almost done. I know people are getting sleepy. So I wanted to say four things that made Pembroke different, that made Pembroke stand out as a revolutionary town. The first one is the currency crisis of 1740. When I was reading the town book, I was astounded by this. I had never seen it before. I have to admit I haven't seen anything about the currency crisis of 1740, but basically the British policy towards the colonies, all their colonies, was called mercantilism. I don't know if some of you have probably heard of mercantilism, but it was basically a way that they made money off the colonies. They basically wanted raw materials from their colonies at cheap prices, and they wanted to send back expensive finished products back to the colonies. So iron and lumber come from Pembroke, and they send harpsichords and guns back to Pembroke at high prices. That's mercantilism. And what's interesting is that the people of Pembroke in 1740, they understood this. The people that wrote this document, Barker, Magoon, Hatch, Jocelyn, Cushing, Lewis, and Bonney, they write this 7-page tome into the Pembroke town meeting book, which is extraordinary. You know, the price of paper was expensive then. To write this whole economic treatise into the Pembroke documents was really interesting. And basically the Pembroke currency crisis was the fact that there was literally no hard currency in the colonies. There wasn't any money to change hands. It was very difficult to do business back and forth between people on a daily basis. And Miles is going to show some evidence of ledgers that people kept where they would keep track of who owed what to who for 10 or 15 years hence. So you would know, you would have in your, everybody would have a document in Pembroke during the 1700s of every penny or every pence that was owed by them, and they would trade those written exchanges of currency. 10 years hence, they would, there are records of a person's son mowing a field, and then 10 years later, that mowing of that field that debt would be carried forward and answered 10 years later. It was an amazing system where everything was based on just taking notes. So, the currency crisis of 1740 was answered by Pembroke by suggesting other ways of printing paper money. The North Shore, Ipswich, for example, they suggested what's called a land bank. So you would have land in response, land would be documented, and bills of payment would be issued on the value of land. Another one was in Boston, they suggested a silver currency. And in Pembroke, they suggested something that's nowhere in other documents, called a manufacturing document. So you trade the value of a factory or goods from a factory for paper money, which could be used as currency. So that's the first thing. And the fines were issued for this kind of thinking. And there was nobody that I know of in Pembroke that were fined this way. But it was an interesting basically the Crown disapproved of this kind of printing of paper money. And so Pembroke, that's the first sort of shot across the bow of the British Empire by Pembroke specifically. The second was Pembroke issued, the Pembroke Town Meeting protested publicly the Stamp Act in 1765. That document's right here. You can read what Pembroke said in their meeting book. And then in 1774, Pembroke, this is now after the Resolves, but Pembroke supported a non-importation agreement. You've all heard of the Revolutionary War. People refused to buy British goods. And Pembroke was one of 7 towns, only 7 towns in the colony that said, we're not going to take British goods. So that's another kind of revolutionary activity. Okay, I guess that's it. So then I just wanted to briefly direct your attention to a document that's kind of interesting that took place. I mentioned Asaph Tracy's house over here. The Asaph Tracy was where the drilling and the recruiting was done over here at Azudad Farm. And if you're interested in reading it, what I've printed here for you is the demand that people appear to be recruited into the French and Indian War. And the language is kind of interesting, but I think I'm going on too long here. I have a picture of Asaph Tracy's farm in the middle of the map on page 12, and it's kind of on the top middle here. And that's where, he was also a treasurer of the town of Pembroke. And I think I'm going to stop because I'm going on quite long here. So one other thing I'll suggest. Oh, the bankrupt letter? I don't know if I have it here. What made the if Pembroke's Resolves could be said to be famous, it would be because of a historian named Bancroft. Where is it? Slide 24. Am I going the right way? Page 5, yikes. I'm lost. 24. You may have heard this. Oh, thanks, Josh. Okay, there we go. Thank you. So at the top on 23, there's a picture of Franklin at the cockpit. And then under that, historian George Bancroft. These are kind of neat. This is kind of neat about Pembroke, so I'll just read it to you. The first official utterance of revolution did not spring from a Congress of the colonies, or future chiefs of the Republic, from the rich who falter or the learned who weigh and debate. The people of the little interior town of Pembroke in Plymouth County, unpretending husbandmen, full of glory of their descendants from the Pilgrims, concluded a clear statement of their grievances with the prediction that if measures so justly complained of were persisted in and enforced by fleets and armies, they will in a little time issue in the total dissolution of the relationship between Britain and the colonies. So that's kind of where the Resolves, people first heard about the Resolves. And just to give you one more thing to look at, because it wouldn't make sense to you if you just saw it without some explanation, was if you look at the last page here, page 20, just to have you see explain what that is. There's a ledger, and this is a conscription ledger, and you'll see the names of people on the left that were actually fought in the French and Indian War. And then down the right side, you'll see little fractions, and these fractions represent how much, what portion of their friends and neighbors actually went to fight in the war. So a person would be conscripted, would go into the service and fight, but then it says next to that, they're representing, certain people are paying for a portion of his service. So for example, a person would go into the army, the town would be told, you need 30 conscripts. And so instead of sending the 30, a person might might save their son from participating by paying for a quarter of the fee of that particular person. So when you look at these people, not all of them fought, their percentages of their earnings would go towards paying for the service of a particular person that went into fight. And that goes along with some of the ledgers that I think Miles is going to show you, which are absolutely fascinating, this business of keeping records of what you owe to somebody else that goes forward or backward 10 years. Okay. And I think the last thing is that the people that were here, these people, Samuel Gould, Hall, Hatch, Stetson, and Turner, they are particularly influential, along with some other people, in why Pembroke was so radical. All right. Any questions about that? What do you think?
Thanks, Steve. I'll keep this short because he took all my time up. No, I won't keep this short, but I'll try to keep it shorter. But so if you look at the 5 Resolve signers, and these are the ones that we're going to be up here doing the reenactment. All of these folks are related in some way. In many cases, they were. Could have been families married into their other families, and they served in the war together, the French-Indian War, and they often did business with each other. So there's a lot of connections there, which we've been finding out over the last 5 years. Every year we have to redo this because we find new things that we didn't discover before. So and we add a different influence to it. So I'll go through these, and it's actually alphabetical order. So the first one is Samuel Gould. So he's a little different in the mix because he's a Quaker, and you would think, why would a Quaker be signing something about going to war with Britain? And his occupation was a yeoman, which was like as a farmer, but it was it wasn't as high standard as a squire or something, but it was a respectful position. And I think I don't know exactly what other business he was involved in, but I think he was against a lot of the taxation and stuff. As a businessman, to support his family, you're taking money away from me, so that's probably how he got involved. He also was related to the Barkers, so he married into the Barker family, so strong Quaker faith. He had 3 daughters. One of them, his oldest daughter, the family was from Hull. His oldest daughter married John Loudon in 1778, and she's actually buried in the Pembroke cemetery here. So she probably, I don't think she might have not. Her husband may have not been a Quaker. one of the daughters married a wing who are out of Sandwich, and a big Quaker family out of Sandwich. So she's buried down in Sandwich, and the other one is buried in lived on High Street and buried in a private cemetery off there. So the interesting thing about Samuel Gould is he was active in the Friends Meeting House, and he's buried there, but we can't find there's about 12 gravestones that are missing in the cemetery, and actually Tracy Marino, we're working on a GPR grant to locate. We have ideas where it is from past pictures of where gravestones were, but some of those are missing. Also, a clockmaker out of Hanover, Bailey, is buried there, and he has, I think he has all 3 wives are buried there, but we can't find those graves. So there's about a dozen missing. Hopefully we'll be able to locate exactly where. And his wife is buried there. Barker is buried there too. And Barker was the one who built the Friends Meeting House in 1706. So if you look at the next page on the back, we've tracked down where most of the where all the Resolves folks lived, except Gould was a little of a mystery, but we believe he lived on High Street. If you look on the left slide, that's a 1790 census, so that's the first U.S. census, and he's at the bottom of the page, Samuel Gould. So this is a year before he passed away. And then if you go about 7 lines up, you'll see a John Loudon, who is his son-in-law. And I looked up his daughter that married him, and she's buried in the cemetery here, where afterwards we can see 2 of the Resolve signers that are buried there. So she's buried there too, and if the first person that can find, I don't know where the grave is, but if you can find it, it's probably closest, maybe 100 yards away, maybe less. We do have a book that Ed Quill published on Pembroke that will be a handout. So if you win, you'll need to come across to the museum to see that. So if you look next to the census, there's a picture, a map. Does everyone see the map of the houses? So this map, you can buy these maps in the library for $8. We have a copy in the Historical Society, but basically it's a map from 1831 that was done by Hales, and then afterwards one of our Historical Society members had taken the map based on the map of 1831 and then the Litchfield, Harry Litchfield's book of the Ancient Treasures of Pembroke. She created this map, so it has houses, and Steve showed one with the Asaph Tracy house where Azadad is. I'll show a couple other examples, but if you see across there's a house on the right, which is High Street, and that's the Brown house. Those were Quakers. That's basically on High Street on the corner of Puddingbrook and High Street from the 1775. The Browns didn't move in. He was from Providence, so he's related to the Brown University family. Married one of his daughters, and the gravesite from Karen Proctor. Karen Proctor actually she published a lot of the Pembroke history, and she was a Barker, 8th generation Barker, and she had access to a lot of the Quaker records. So she took a picture of this gravesite, which is behind a house on High Street. So that's where one of his daughters is buried. And then a picture of the Friends Meeting House. We're actually, the Meeting House, has everyone been in the Meeting House? Or we do tours through the year, probably quarterly. So, and we're doing a wall restoration project from preservation money. We've got $50,000 to work with for that. So that's going to be going on this year. and then also a preservation of the building, $35,000 for restoring the carpentry on the outside, some on the inside, masonry work for the chimney, and painting. So that's all exciting. We will have to keep you guys posted on that. And so let's see here. The next one is Dr. Jeremiah Hall, and he was one of the first doctors in Pembroke. He served in the French Indian War. We actually have his medicine bag at the museum, so if you come by after, we can show you. It's basically, I think Steve had some slides in there. It showed things for things like morphine type things, and it's a really cool. It was donated in 1912 for the bicentennial by one of the Collmores, and so that's in the museum. So that's very cool. So in 1761, after the French Indian War, he moved into the King's Highway Inn, which was built in 1660. So it's kind of interesting. The house was already 100 years old when he moved in there. He served in the Provincial Congress, and according to Collmore's history, in June 1775, he was traveling with Joseph Warren, who one of our founding fathers, and Joseph Warren actually died that day, June 1775, in Bunker Hill. He was a leader, but he had the passion for getting involved in the thick of things. So Jeremiah Hall might have been one of the last to see him alive, and Jeremiah Hall he was a friend of George Washington's doctor. So George Washington didn't stay at the King's Highway Inn, but his doctor did. And sadly, Dr. Jeremiah Hall is buried over here. His son died in the siege of Boston, actually in Cambridge, in 1776. So that was. These guys really had the blood, sweat, and tears.
Everybody might not know where the King's Highway Inn is.
The King's Highway Inn is basically, if you go to near Puddingbrook Pantry, it's across from where the Cutler building was, and so it's just before the Briggs Cemetery. Any other landmarks? Rapture, Puddingbrook, right? It's cool, and so the interesting thing about the King's Highway Inn is Steve and I got in there to visit. They'd been doing some work inside. There's if you notice on that page, see the long chimney, how big that chimney is. There's an inscription on there for 1660. I had a picture of Steve up there, but we couldn't find that. So, so that's the original part of the house. If you go to next to the chimney, there's the pub room, which is the original fireplace. And we're walking through, and Steve noticed a brick that said Cuddy Hunk on it, which we didn't know exactly what it said. We took a picture of it, and his wife. Had looked at it and said, "Oh, it says Cuddy Hunk." So I'm like, why is Cuddy Hunk here? That's an island off of Martha's Vineyard it was settled before Mayflower, before the Pilgrims, 1602, and they were looking for sassafras over there. So that was used for medical purposes, but also medical purposes could be used for maybe alcohol too. There's a restaurant down on Falmouth called Bad Martha's, and they have a story of this where these folks went over to the island to look for ingredients for their beer. So I don't know which is true, but we just contacted the Cuddy Hunk Historical Society on this connection, and it turns out our theory was that there were a lot of Quakers over in that in Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, that kind of area. And there were ministers there that were trying to have the Native Americans get Christianized. And so that was going on in the 1660s and so. But then, does anyone remember the name Samuel Sewall? Does that name sound familiar? He was noted for the Salem witchcraft back in in the 1690s, and what was the year? 1692. So then after that, he had a role where he would help the ministers come over here, and she did locate that he had come to the Barker House in probably the early 1700s. Between 1699 and 1720, he was in Pembroke, or what was called Duxbury then. He would have been in that house, and if he was with a minister from the Cuttyhunk area. The original house was built in the 1660s, so if we can find the exact date that he was there, then that would identify when the pub area was created. Later on, the building extends over, as you can see. Some of that was built in 1750, so we're still trying to track down the exact date, but it seems like the connection was Samuel Sewall. You'll see the medical bag here on the right as well, so that's at the Historical Society. So the next one is Hatch. Seth Hatch. Is people familiar with the Seth Hatch house on Water Street? It's a red house. It was up for sale a few years ago. It's before one of the new development streets, and let's see here. So Captain Seth Hatch was another one that fought in the French Indian War, and he's probably the most recognized. He set up a blockade in the French Indian War to block the French from Quebec, and also provides supplies to the British General Wolfe. General Wolfe actually donated some goods to some of his tent gear to Seth. So whatever that value of that is, I don't know if you like to camp out or something, but so Captain Seth Hatch married into the Turner family, Turner Shipyard. So his brother-in-law was Thomas Turner Jr., that was a captain in the Revolutionary War, and he lived in the River House. One of the readers here, Andrew Sullivan, lives there, and so he's playing the part of his homeowner's brother-in-law, Seth Hatch. And you'll see pictures of the house on the next page. It's a beautiful red house. He had his general store there, so that's the ledger that Steve was talking about. We have a ledger that's from 1737. He started writing actively in the 1760s, so we have some great information on him. In 1790, he's buried at Packet Landing, which is off of Water Street. There's a lot of graves on Water Street, and they're named different names, and some of them are confusing. 2 Mile Cemetery, Packett's Landing. It's actually the cemetery off Packett's Landing Road where he's buried. And he had a packet ship he had made by Ichabod Thomas Jr. in 1790. And then he died in 1799. So if you go to the page, so the Seth Hatch house is here. It's a red house. If you see the map there, so that's Water Street. So his house is before the 139 cutoff. So it's just up from the post office on the left. And that house was, previous to that, it was Holmes' house back in the 1690s, but he probably added on to it along the way. We did discover his gravesite at the Packet Landing, and Lydia Osborne, for the vet, assisting on the veterinary thing, the vet's office, she had it properly recognized. Any questions on, and we do have someone that lives in the Captain Seth Hatch here house. So we actually have some of his ledgers that are in that ledger book, and it's very interesting because the penmanship is outstanding. 1765, one David Standish spent 519 pounds between 1765 and 1767. And like Steve said, it has things like, because money was hard to come by in cash, and so sometimes they barter, and in some cases he would do work for people. So this was, one of them's 519 pounds, which back then that's worth $100. So that's $52,000 that he spent over mostly over a couple years period. There's Dr. Jeremiah Hall here purchasing things in 1766, including 180 feet of pine boards. So he could have used those boards in the King's Highway. He could have used those in the King's Highway Inn that he moved into. Back then, they were supposed to only have boards that were 12 inches long, but they went against the 12 inches wide, and but a lot of these were 30 inches or so. Yeah. So he also apparently was a tutor, because he schooled two of Jeremiah Hall's children for £5. So he was a teacher. He had a general store. He was a captain, and then he also supplied to Ichabod Thomas, who built the ship, the Beaver, that was in the brick kiln shipyard. And actually, next year is the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, so we're going to have a celebration. Boston will have their own. We'll have ours here and go to the brick kiln shipyard and do some. Ichabod Thomas is buried at the Briggs Cemetery, so we'll do a tea party there, and then we'll go over to the brick kiln and do a celebration there. So again, he did some schooling for the Thomas children too. So I have a copy here I'll pass around, and then we have other copies in the museum, and I welcome people to look through the ledger book. It's quite interesting. All right, Captain Seth H. We're almost there. Okay. So what's next after H? Stetson. So Abel Stetson is, he was a little difficult to track down. He's basically was in the second parish, which is in 1820. That's became the town of Hanson. Actually, Josh has a book where Hanson was named after a newsman who faced injury in the War of 1812, and so there's a book. We have some at the museum, and then so the town of Hanson is named after someone from Baltimore, of all things. But 1820 is when Hanson became. But before that, it was the second parish for quite a long time. Abel. We found his gravesite. Does anyone know where the airfield is in Hanson? I think it's blocked off now, but I've walked through there, and the Stetson Cemetery is in the back, which is on, I believe, Chandler Mill Pond, but it's very close to Stetson Pond too, and there's the first person buried there died of smallpox, and then I think Abel Stetson was buried there second in 1776. So he died basically a couple weeks before Jeremiah Hall's son died in the war, and he died. So that was a tough month for the Resolve folks. If you look at the back with the pictures of Abel Stetson, I can find it here myself. I told you we'd get lost. Let's see here. So if you look at, and this is where the fun research comes into play. So the Stetson, I was looking up, because I had all the other houses, so, and the Gould research, so I was trying to find out where Stetson had lived. There's a Macri database that has all the houses in each town that have been documented by the Mass Historical Commission. Pembroke's got many, probably 100 or so, and his wasn't listed there, but I did find a deed. The earliest deed was from 1762, and if you look on the left there, that's the deed. You can find those on the Plymouth County Record of Deeds online. You can search for those, and in this deed, it talked about something about 50,000 pounds. So there was something attached to this land that we're not sure exactly what estate that was, but if you look at below that is it's hard to see, but that's part of the Major's purchase, which Tilson was a map. He did a lot of maps in this area, and he has maps of the Major's purchase. Is people familiar with that, about the Native Americans? Wampatuck sold land to Winslow and 35 other investors. So they had 70 lots. Each of them had 2 lots of 40 acres. So the lot 43 belonged to Thomas, who was a relative of the Stetsons. And then Al Giannatasio right here, he's our crack research man from Pembroke, and he's lived everywhere pretty much, around here mostly, but he found the Stetson pond and where the house is, similar to those other maps. So there was a Stetson house across from the Stetson pond, and then he found a house, took a picture of a house, and we scanned in on it, and sure enough, the plaque, the date board said Abel Stetson, 1762. So the house is in rough shape, as is the cemetery. That cemetery in Hanson needs a lot of preservation work. It's in one of the worst shapes of all the cemeteries that I've seen in this area. So that's Abel Stetson. He had relatives that were Halls and relatives that were Hatches, and served in the war. And so we finally found out, thanks to Al's help there, we found out where he lived. And the last but not least is John Turner. He's noted as the official author. And let me find John Turner. So John Turner was the town clerk of the Resolves, and I'm going to be playing him today in our enactment. So he was a town clerk for many years. He was very involved in some of the movements around anti-slavery, and his homestead is, if you look at the back page of that, that's located at the corner of Barker Street and Washington Street. So the yellow house, you'll see the before and after. I hope you can tell which is before and after on that, but it's a lot of work's gone into that in preserving the outside, getting it structurally sound. That property, there was a dig by the Fisk Center at UMass Boston, and they did a dig there in 2019, and that area was settled in 1640 by a man named John Hudson, and his family married into the Turners, and so from 1688 till the 1830s, a Turner had lived there, and so that house, the house standing now was built. The front of that house was constructed by one of John Turner's his grandson, but the original house goes back to the 1720s, and John Turner added to the house in 1760 because he had very successful sawmills and grist mills, and did very well, and that whole area had a lot of mills of the time. So now that is on town property, so the next thing is deciding what to do with the building in the public safety area. So is it become a museum or some kind of function room? So that's we encourage people for their input to see. We'd like to have a good future for what to do in that building. So now we have the other thing that Steve had mentioned around Ben Franklin, around the Resolves, was not only he didn't like Pembroke because the Resolves showed up and he got in trouble, but then the Tea Party, we got a guy from Pembroke making the ship that got him into trouble. So he must have hated Pembroke. But anyway, so where are we now, Steve? Yep. So we are going to do the reenactment now. So if you guys all step up.
In the conversation around the creation of the Resolves. So John Turner and 4 other men are chosen as a committee of correspondence for Pembroke. They are discussing their feelings and beliefs about the behavior of the King's men in the colonies and their treatment of the people of Massachusetts. Pembroke Town Clerk John Turner has just completed transcribing 10 arguments or resolves stating Pembroke's stance on the situation. They have not yet signed the resolves.
These resolves will be very clear and decisive. The King and Parliament have once again violated our Constitution and our rights as Englishmen. Our own elected representatives in the Massachusetts legislature, called the Great and General Court, have been ignored. Parliament has determined to take away our rights to pay the salaries of the governor and Superior Court judges. The King's Council will now pay salaries from import duties collected at the Custom House. This is a menacing innovation toward the total abolition of fair trials and equitable issues of law. It directly affects both of our lives and property by making judges depend on the Crown for their livelihoods. It has a tendency to bias the minds of judges and prevent a strict impartiality which ought to attend their decisions. Currently, there are 2,000 soldiers in Boston at the moment that have been here since landing in October of 1768. If this innovation is enforced by fleets and armies, the result will be the total dissolution of the union between mother country and the colonies, to the infinite loss of the former and the regret of the latter.
Well, a pamphlet written by the Boston Committee of Correspondence is why we are here. 600 copies were distributed throughout the 250 Massachusetts towns to all our clergy and selectmen. The pamphlet had 3 parts to it: a state of the rights of the colonists, a list of infringements and violations of rights, and a letter of correspondence addressed to the other towns. Part 3 asked each town to respond with their own thoughts. Most towns have read and discussed the pamphlet. Some towns, like our neighbor Marshfield, have declared it treasonous. We here in Pembroke have written these resolves.
Our signing of this document is dangerous to all of us and to our families. Our action is considered treasonous. We could forfeit our land and property and even our lives. As a member of the Pembroke Society of Friends, the Quakers, I'm a pacifist. But while I abhor violence, I must oppose unfair taxes, such as the Stamp Act, which Pembroke citizens oppose so strongly, we are one of only 7 towns in the colony to support a non-importation agreement. I have a conflict. My opposition to a violation of our rights and the possibility that this opposition will result in a war. I'm a pacifist. My signing these resolves may cause me and my family to be banned from our assembly.
Well, Seth and I fought 15 years ago in the French and Indian War to expel the Papist French in the expedition to Canada. Dr. Hall bravely tended to our sick, injured, and dying. We know the dangers of battle, and this document may help to lead another long and more deadly war with many more casualties. It was helpful when Reverend Gad Hitchcock from our second parish, where I'm a member, counseled our men to prepare for battle prior to the French and Indian War in the late 1750s. He will do the same for us if we must fight the British. He did this in a special service at the second parish. It was back in October of 1757 where he gave a sermon before a company of volunteers for the revival of military skill. I will quote his lecture taken from 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 22 and 33. There are numbers of bands that were ready, armed to the war, and came to David, to Hebron, to turn to the kingdom of Saul to him, according to the word of the Lord of Zebulun, such as went forth to battle, expert in war, with all the instruments of war, 50,000 which could keep rank. They were not of the double heart. And that day the Reverend Hitchcock concluded they would prepare for death and patiently submit to its stroke when it comes, believing firmly that Jesus Christ is the resurrection and the life, and that though we die, yet we shall live. Finally, become conquerors even over our death itself, through him, who must reign till he hath put all enemies under his feet. Thanks be to God, who giveth us victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
By signing this, I risked the life of my son Jeremiah, who is of age to fight and die for the cause. I know the terrible price of war, having served as company doctor under the command of Pembroke's captain, Captain Abel Keene, in the attack on Canada in 1756. This is worth the risk of losing my son.
Yes, Jeremiah, my son Abel is of the age to take part in such risks.
I used my skills in captaining a vessel for the British blockade of the St. Lawrence River during the French and Indian War. I also used for the British Navy in supplying British troops served under General Wolfe, who died at the Battle of Quebec. Now the vessels we build here on the North River may serve for or against the British Navy.
Signing the document will put us at risk of being declared traitors. This means penalty of death and also puts our families in danger of losing all land and property for now and for future generations. If we need to take action against the British Parliament, Pembroke will do so in numbers. Many of our men fought in the past war. In conclusion, if they bring fleet and armies, we fear that shortly it will bring the total dissolution with sadness, and we be forced to separate from the crown. Do I have a motion to sign these resolves before us?
I so move.
Do we have a second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion passed.
One of the results. The preamble reads like this. At a meeting of the freeholders and other inhabitants of the town of Pembroke, duly warned in assembly, according to law, the 28th day of December 1772, after reading a pamphlet received from the town clerk of Boston, directed to our selectmen by order of said town, and by a vote approving the state of rights of the colonies and this province in particular, the list of the infringements and violations of these rights and the letter of correspondence contained in the said pamphlet, the following resolves were agreed upon, nemi contradicente, which means without protest. Resolved
that this province and the town as part of it has the right, whenever they think necessary, to give their sense of public measures as if judged to be unconstitutional and oppressive, to declare it freely and remonstrate or petition as they deem best.
Resolved, that it is particularly necessary in the present alarming crisis of our affairs to give our opinion and cause it to be known, that not just a few men or dissension in spirits, as have been falsely represented, but the whole body of the people complain and are uneasy.
Resolved, that although the British Parliament is the grand legislature of the nation, yet according to the original compact solemnly made and entered into between the King of England and our ancestors at their first coming into the country and the present royal charter, no legislative authority can be exercised in or over this province but that of the great and general court of assembly, consisting of the King or his representatives, His Majesty's Council, and the House of Representatives.
Resolved, that the acts of the British Parliament made for and executed within the limits of this province are, in our opinion, against the law and the most essential principles of our Constitution.
Resolved, that the attacks that have of late years in this way has been made by mere strife for ministerial influence, are daily making of our happy Constitution, are of very alarming nature, and ought to exercise the jealousy and attention of every member of the community, and that every member of the community are advised, at a minimum, to regard them as enemies of their country.
Resolved, the rights and liberties, civil and religious, which have been transmitted to us from our illustrious ancestors, ought to be deemed sacred and their posterity be kept secure by us.
Resolved, particularly that the late ministerial maneuver in affixing stipends of salaries to the offices of the judges of the Superior Court is an innovation that menaces the total abolition of fair trials and equitable issues of law, and directly affects both the life and property of the subject, as an entire dependence on the Crown for the support has a tendency to bias the mind of judges and prevent the strict impartiality which ought to guide their decisions. But it is not our design to reflect in the least on the very respectable gentlemen who at present adorn these offices, but to ground our opinion on the imperfection and depravity of human nature.
Resolved that the measures so justly complained of by this province are persisted in and enforced by fleets and armies. And they will, when we think of it with pain, in brutal time lead to the total dissolution of the former and the regret of the latter.
Resolved, that the representatives of this town be instructed, and importantly, he is instructed to use his utmost efforts in the next sessions of our General Assembly to obtain a radical redress of our grievances.
Resolved, that a committee for grievances be chosen to correspond with the several committees of the same denomination in our metro plain and the other towns throughout the province, and report to this town such proposals as may be thought proper to remove our unparalleled hardships. And accordingly, the following gentlemen were chosen for the above purposes in order to transmit a copy of the proceedings of this town at the present meeting to the Committee of Correspondence